Dust to Dust by Maria Rojas. Dawn broke gray over the hills and across the desolate plains of West Texas. Birds flew out of the half-darkness in search of their morning pickings, and George Henry Buckner was there for the same. He lay flat on his bedroll behind the rocks of a south-facing hill, high on his perch above the Guthrie brothers' camp. He would not risk lighting a campfire, so the night was spent under his duster and wool blanket, waiting sleepless for new light while his bay horse, Rusty, stood saddled and nickering. "Easy, boy," he said. "There'll be breakfast soon." George Henry gazed at the photograph he kept inside his old brass compass. The picture stared back through hazy eyes that had never captured their sparking life. He feared the image was already fading, and once gone, it would also part from his mind and leave him truly alone. The brass trinket disappeared back into his coat, and the gunslinger turned on his stomach, tossing aside the wool blanket. He raised his hat brim and watched the three men stir around the smoky remains of their dying fire. He chambered a .43 caliber Egyptian and aimed his Remington rolling block rifle on the camp. His left shoulder failed to keep the rifle steady, and he cursed the day long ago when a momentary distraction in battle earned him the wound and almost cost him his life. He propped the weakened limb on a rock, and the sight held true. Once the men were up and gathering their effects, he looked for Marc Guthrie, youngest of the three and fastest draw. He squeezed the trigger, and the hammer went through the breech block with a loud crack that rang for miles, echoing across the plains and bouncing off the hills. The heavy recoil of the center-fire Egyptian meant a slower reload, but the caliber was necessary to cover the distance. The rifle's plume gave away his location, but the Guthries hadn't a prayer to do much about it. Marc Guthrie was hit square in the chest and landed flat on the dry dirt while his siblings drew their pistols and fired around wildly. They tried to cover their escape, but the horses were still not gun-broken and two of the animals fled. The oldest brother, Lenny, held tight to his own gray Appaloosa. He mounted and threw a hand out to the last of his brothers left standing, Julius. George Henry cocked the hammer and threw the breech block open. The first empty cartridge flew past him. He chambered a second round and fired again. Julius spun like a dust devil as the shot hit his shoulder. The man went down as another empty cartridge flew past George Henry's face with the sharp smell of gunpowder. Lenny Guthrie gripped the reins and dug both heels into his horse, taking off in a boil of dust. A third shot cracked across the morning plains, biting the gasket off Lenny Guthrie's Appaloosa. The animal swayed with a loud scream but kept on running. George Henry jumped to his feet, holstering the Remington on Rusty's saddle scabbard. He put away his bedroll and watched Julius crawl for cover behind a fallen tree, then jumped on the bay and rode down to meet him. There was no catching up to Lenny now, but Julius still had some wind in him. Rusty slowly circled around the fallen tree while George Henry trained his Colt Peacemaker on Julius. Tears welled up as the man heard the familiar forked clicks of its hammer. "Please, mister, you got the wrong fellers here," Julius said. "My kin and I ain't nothing more than businessmen from back in Fort Worth, and we ain't got no money here with us." "I know exactly what kind of men you are and the business you're in," George Henry said. "I've been chasing your worthless hides all the way from San Angelo." Julius pleaded with a hand pressed on his bleeding shoulder. "Mister, my older brother who rode out, he keeps our earnings with him. You want money? I can tell you where he gone to. Just hold your fire." George Henry raised his hat and squinted at the sun coming over the hills. The crinkles around his eyes were red from riding and caked with dirt and sweat. It was a face that had seen better days, but didn't hold a candle for the future. He lowered his Colt and sat on the rotting tree, lighting a cigarette on the dying embers. "Speak then," he said. Julius blinked out tears. "We was all heading down to Mexico to cross down San Felipe if all went well. Don't seem like that's an option anymore." "There's more, but you gotta give your word you ain't gonna shoot me." "If I wanted to shoot you, I've done it already," George Henry spat. "But if you're inclined to waste one more damn minute, Lord help me, I'll put a bullet between your eyes right this second." He'll be heading west to that, Julius continued. Out in the desert, there's a few hills that go down to the bend in the river, shallow enough to cross this time of year. George Henry grunted and holstered his Colt before mounting Rusty. Wait a minute, mister. You can't just leave me here in the desert. You said you wasn't going to kill me, but this is as good as dead. I said I wasn't going to shoot you. Whatever those buzzards got in mind for you is another business altogether. George Henry gave his horse a squeeze and whipped the reins forward on Lenny's trail. As the horse rode away, the vultures settled on the dead trees around Julius with nothing but time and patience on their side. The lush plains of the cattle barrens soon gave in to the unforgiving southern earth of hot gravel and wiry shrubs. It was land that refused to accept its demise and would gladly drag you down with it. But no matter which way Lenny Guthrie took through the wasteland, George Henry had to cut him at the border before he crossed into Mexico and got lost in San Lorenzo. Rusty dragged his beaten hooves along the arid terrain, fueled solely by the last bit of grain in the saddlebags, just as George Henry gnawed on the remaining leathery lump of salted pork. The sun was high and his canteen right about empty. His head swooned as he tipped the last drops to his mouth and thought of tying himself to the saddle before the sun pushed him off. But with no water or shade, he'd soon be secured to a four-legged corpse all the same. Somewhere in the twisting heat up ahead, George Henry caught the unlikely sight of a young man along the desert road. He was dressed in black, from boots to hat. His coat was clean, one of those fancy numbers often seen on southern gentlemen. He stepped aside and George Henry loosened the hammer thong from his Colt as he intended to keep riding right along and far from whatever trouble that was. But the young man called to him. "Greetings, mister. Where are you headed?" "No place you'd like to be in," he said, trotting right along. "That may be, but I already don't like being here one bit." "I don't doubt it, kid, but I ain't got time for it." "Mister, have a heart. The inside of my boots are already hot as a griddle." George Henry pulled gently on the reins and looked around for accomplices. Bandits often played tricks of sympathy to ambush a man, but the road was scarce on hiding places, and the young man didn't look the rugged type. "How'd a kid like you end up walking along this waste on your own?" He scratched on the rough stubble on his face. "You got robbed?" "It's a hell of an embarrassing thing. You see, I stopped to tend to some quick business on a small farm just over yonder hill, and a fella gone stole my horse. I would appreciate the kindness of you riding me up to the closest town." "Why you gonna left your horse like that, kid? Don't you know where you are?" Like I said," he chuckled, "it's awfully embarrassing. Kid, if I waste any more time, I'm gonna lose this son of a bitch I'm after." "If you don't mind me saying, that horse of yours looks like it's about to kick it, and you're barely hanging on them reins yourself. Farm up there got water and shade." George Henry lowered his head and grunted. "Tell you what, if your friends up in that farm got water for me and my horse, I'd be willing to take you as far as San Morello or Camp Pancho's." "That won't be a problem at all," the boy smiled. "Farm's empty now, and they got everything one could need, all except for a horse." "Now that's mighty peculiar," the old man grunted. "You better be telling it straight or I'll shoot you and anyone else out there." "I wouldn't lie to you, mister." The old man held out one dust-caked leathery hand to help the boy up. "Name's George Henry Buckner," he said. "Pleased to make your acquaintance," the boy smiled. "Folks around here call me Death."